the photo you can see now is a picture of me with a friend of mine in Antarctica. This, oops, hang on a second. Let's go on the wrong screen. There we go. That's a selfie I took at the North Pole in 2003. So I
remember that from the TED Talk.
That was in a TED Talk, exactly. So I've led 12 big expeditions now, and I've covered. Now, would you prefer things in kilometers or miles? I can't remember what you do in Canada.
Kilometers.
You guys, kilometers. That's easy for me too. So I have walked about 7,000 kilometers now, either in the Arctic or in Antarctica, in these 12 big expeditions. And I'm going to talk to you today about one trip in particular that was down here. This is a satellite image, or a composite satellite image of Antarctica, which is at the bottom of the world. Hopefully you all know that. And it's an extraordinary place. So unlike the North Pole, which is in the middle of the sea, the North Pole is in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. So if you walk there, and I walked there in 2004, you are walking over the frozen surface of the sea. Whereas Antarctica is land, it's a continent, it's a massive continent. It is about the same size as China and India put together. So it's huge. It's nearly twice the size of Australia. It's the coldest place on the planet. In winter, they have temperatures of below minus 90 degrees centigrade. So it's the coldest place in the world. It's the driest continent on Earth. It has less precipitation than Africa. So if you imagine all the snow, if you turn that into rain, it has less than Africa. So it's a desert in a weird way. It's the windiest place on Earth. The highest ever wind speeds on the planet have been recorded in Antarctica. And it is the highest altitude continent on Earth. It averages about 2,500 meters above sea level. So it's a land of extremes. And in October 2013, my friend, he was called Tarka. He's half French, so he's got a funny name, Tarka Lepinière. Tarka and I very simply walked from the bottom of this red line you can see, so the coast of Antarctica, a place called Ross Island, to the South Pole, which is the other end of the red line in the middle of Antarctica. And we turned around and walked back again. So to give you an idea of scale, I put a couple of maps here. This is, hopefully you recognize, the United States and Great Britain and Ireland on the left. So that gives you an idea of scale. The total round trip was 2,888 kilometers. So that is about the same as doing nearly 70 marathons back to back. Except we weren't just running marathons. We were on skis, walking on skis, and dragging sledges with everything we thought we would need, because there are no shops in Antarctica, there are no cafes or restaurants. So we were dragging everything behind us. We had 200 kilos each at the start, so loads and loads of weight. And this was quite a fun headline. I mean, I'm happy to set up. Two explorers just completed a polar expedition that killed everyone the last time it was attempted. So my mum wasn't very happy about this plan, because not many people had tried this. 9 people in history had tried this. None of them had finished it, and 5 of them had died in the process. So it was a risky journey, and it was last attempted by this guy. This is a British explorer called Captain Scott. If you haven't heard of Scott, you might have heard of Shackleton, who was his rival, his contemporary. This was about 100 years ago. These two guys were among a small group of people who were trying to become the first to reach the South Pole. And these expeditions 100 years ago had a lot in common with the idea perhaps of flying to Mars in our lifetimes, or in your lifetimes, in that these people were sailing away from home. They would sail down to Antarctica in wooden ships. They were often away for 3 years at a time with no communication, no hope of being rescued if anything went wrong. So they were away for years and years. And Scott's last attempt started in 1910. He sailed away from the UK with his team. They got to Antarctica a year later. They had to build a hut, stay in the hut for the winter, and then they set off the next spring. And Scott had a big team using, you can see here, they've got some ponies. They had ponies, they had a few dogs, they had some tractors, and they had men dragging supplies, building a sort of supply chain reaching out towards the South Pole. Captain Scott got there in January 1912, but he was pretty disappointed with what he found because someone had been there before them. You can't see because it's black and white, but on the far left of this photograph is a flag. There was a flag already flying at the South Pole. They found the tent you can see behind them, and they'd been beaten to it by a Norwegian team led by a guy called Roald Amundsen. Amundsen had got there a few weeks before them using dogs and dog sleds. And at this point, Scott's team of 5 must have been pretty disappointed, pretty demoralized. They turned around, started walking back all the way back to the coast, back to nearly 1,500 kilometers back to the coast of Antarctica, and none of them survived. All 5 of these guys died on the return leg of that journey in 1912. And no one had finished this journey ever since. And to me, it seemed amazing. So these guys had covered, I think, about 2,500 kilometers on foot. I'm trying to convert miles to kilometers in my head. About 2,500 kilometers, which is a record that stood until 2014. So until we broke it. So to me, for years, it seemed amazing that the sort of biggest human achievement in the toughest place on Earth. It was almost to me as if the marathon record or the Ironman triathlon record had been set in 1912, and no one had been able to break it ever since, despite a century's worth of technology and innovation. So I decided to try and finish the job, and that's what Taka and I did. Now, some people said, well, Ben, why didn't you do it properly? Why don't you wear the same clothes and drag a wooden sleigh behind you and eat the same food? Don't take a GPS, don't take a satellite phone. And I didn't think about that for very long, partly because I'm not completely silly, and also because if you look at Scott or Shackleton, they were using the best technology, the best clothing, the best equipment they could find. So we were a very high-tech expedition. You can see that's Taka and me with our sledges. We were the sledges were made of carbon fiber, super lightweight. We had satellite phone. We had a very small laptop with us. We had loads of really cool technology, and we started from exactly the same place because Captain Scott's wooden hut is still standing on the shore of Ross Island in Antarctica. It's basically like a freezer all year round. So the hut is like this incredible museum. We had about 20 minutes inside. This is Captain Scott's bed. That's one of his sleeping bags made of reindeer skin. You can see a pair of socks hanging up. You can see a chair at his desk. And it was a weird place. It looked and felt like Captain Scott and his men had left a few minutes ago. The table was still laid. There was a kettle on the stove. So it kind of felt quite cozy and homely and lived in, but it also felt pretty spooky. And I suddenly felt very, very scared. I remember thinking, hang on a minute, this is the journey that had defeated Shackleton, killed Captain Scott. They're two of the biggest names, two of the biggest sort of heroes in my world. And no one has attempted this since. Why is that? And what the heck am I doing down here thinking I can finish it? So I suddenly felt very, very scared. And off we went. Now, if you've seen anything on TV about Antarctica, now there are lots of wonderful movies and documentaries and TV programs, but they're normally about penguins. And you might think that Antarctica is covered with penguins, which actually isn't true. Most of Antarctica has nothing living at all. No plants, no animals, no birds, no insects, no viruses, no bacteria, nothing going on. It's a big white desert with no life. And the only living things down there, the only indigenous life, so you have penguins and seals and a few other birds, the only living things live around the coast where the weather is warmest. So once you get into the middle away from the coast, it is completely blank. And we started our journey by walking across an area called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is about the same size as France, except unlike France, there's nothing going on. There are no hills, no valleys, no towns, no villages, nothing. So we walked in a straight line for 28 days. That was what the view looked like for nearly a month before we finally got to the mountains. And that's when the weather's good. When the weather's not so good, you can't see a thing. We had lots of days of very bad weather. You get something called whiteout, where you get low cloud and fog and mist, and we couldn't see anything at all. So the weather was really tough. And one of the hardest things was that we were living in this little tent. That was our home for 108 nights, so 3.5 months in Antarctica. And if I show you a picture of the inside, that's Tarka about to get into bed. You can see my sleeping bag next to his. And if I tell you that we didn't wash for 108 days, we had no hot water, no soap, no shampoo, no shower gel, no shower, no way of washing. If I tell you we changed our underwear 3 times in 3.5 months, then you'll understand when I say we learned a few things about getting on as a small team. Tarka was an old friend of mine. We'd done a few big trips together before, so we knew we had a lot of trust and a lot of faith in each other, but we'd also seen small teams sort of fall apart under this sort of pressure when things are really tough. So we tried to figure out how we could best get on as a team of 2. And the thing we learned really was it was important to be honest with each other. We both understood that if something wasn't working with our clothing or our gear, if a zipper busts or if a tent gets a little rip in it, if you don't fix it straight away, then it becomes a really serious issue in those sorts of conditions. And the same thing was true of our partnership and our friendship. Like if something wasn't working, if the other person was doing something that was annoying or not doing something that was holding us back, then we had to try and fix it straight away before it became a big issue. So that worked. We're still very good friends now. Tarka actually lives in France, in the Alps. I mentioned some of the tech we had. Intel technology company were a big sponsor, so we had lots and lots of schools, mostly in the UK and Europe, were following us online, so we could answer their questions and reply to their messages. So that was awesome. We had, you can see the little satellite phone. So we had basically a really rubbish internet connection. So we couldn't look at the news, we couldn't look at social media. We could just send once a day, one little update for our website. So we had no email, no internet, no social media for nearly 4 months. Once we got to the mountains, we kind of turned right a little bit and had to start heading uphill. And we walked up one of the largest glaciers. In fact, it's the largest valley glacier on Earth, called the Beardmore Glacier. It's about 150, 160 kilometers long, 30 kilometers wide. It's a massive bit of ice. And in some ways, it was really exciting. Not many people have walked up the Beardmore Glacier. Very few people have walked down it, and we did both because we went to the South Pole and back. It turns out Tarka and I are the only living people that have walked up and down the Beardmore Glacier, which is pretty cool. And suddenly the scenery and the terrain change. You can see mountains in the background, and you can also see this really shiny surface. So it's so windy on the glacier that the snow doesn't settle, it just blows off. And you get this rock hard surface called blue ice. So we couldn't use our skis. We had to use crampons, which are like spikes on our boots. And we're traveling slowly uphill. So it took us a week to get up the glacier. And in some ways, it was a real highlight. Very few people have ever been there. This is one of the most remote places on the planet. It was beautiful. We had these amazing mountains. We'd see valleys every day that we were sure no one had ever walked down. So it was a really cool place. But it was pretty scary because it's also covered in things called crevasses, which are these deep cracks in the glacial ice. And you can see Tarka's actually sitting on his sledge here, looking at a map, having a little break. But you can see some of these cracks in the ice just behind him. So some of them were quite narrow, you can step across them. Other ones were massive and quite dangerous. And then finally, a week later, we popped out at the top on what's called the Antarctic Plateau. So now we're nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. Really difficult, really cold, really windy. And ultimately, after 61 days, we arrived at the South Pole, which for us was our halfway point. Now, Captain Scott wrote in his diary in 1912 about the South Pole, great God, this is an awful place. And for us, actually, it was a weird moment as well, because nowadays there's a massive scientific base at the South Pole. The original base was built in the 1950s, and that's now been decommissioned and dismantled. So on the right-hand side of this photo, it almost looks like a giant junkyard where the old base used to be. And then the little dark green rectangle you can see on the left, that's the big science base. So there were nearly 300 people there, mostly scientists working. Now we arrived in the summer, midsummer, because Antarctica is in the southern hemisphere. Summer's actually in December, which is confusing. And summer's a misleading term in Antarctica because we still had days where it was -20 or -30 degrees centigrade. So it's pretty cold. There is a pole at the South Pole. So we took a photograph and turned around and started walking back to the coast again. And things got really tough here. We had a few weeks of really bad weather. We started running low on our food that we were dragging with us. So we had to, after a while, we had to start halving our rations and eating half our food. And that meant we got pretty hungry, pretty tired, pretty skinny. This is a photo of Tarka. It's a special occasion because he's changing his underwear, obviously, in the tent. But you can see he's lost a lot of weight. And I was in the same sort of physical condition. So we were really at the very limits of what was humanly possible, really pushing ourselves hard. This is heading back down the Beardmore Glacier, and we found at the bottom of the glacier that some of the biggest crevasses that were easy to navigate around on our way up had been covered in fresh snow. And I think the next photo, here we go. This is me following Tarka's tracks, and you can see these big sort of sunken areas of snow. They're actually big holes, they're big crevasses. And I think there's one more picture. That's one of them from the side. So we're crossing over what are called snow bridges. So if I go back, you can see that's me sort of about to cross one of these snow bridges. And this is one that's sort of collapsed. So we had to cross lots and lots of these, which was pretty scary, before we finally got back onto the Ross Ice Shelf. All we had to do to finish was walk diagonally across a bit of ice the same size as France. Took us another 3 weeks. And then finally on day 108, we reached this pretty unexciting looking finish line. This was it. And there is definitely a finish line. You can see just in front of our two sledges, there's actually a crack between the ice and the land. So the land is Ross Island and the ice is the Ross Ice Shelf. Captain Scott's hut is just over that ridge in the background. So this would have been the finish line for Captain Scott if he'd survived. The people in wearing black and orange coveralls, they're scientists from New Zealand. They have a little base just down the coast. They came to clap us over the line. And it was a weird feeling. I'd always imagined that the last hour of this journey would be the most emotional hour of my whole life, that Tarka and I'd be skiing along in tears, high-fiving, hugging, really excited. And actually we were so exhausted that we almost sort of collapsed over the line. I just remember feeling really, really empty. And it took a long time. It took probably 6 months, maybe a year for it to really sink in and for me to really appreciate what we'd done. But we had made the longest ever polar journey on foot, 2,888 kilometers. That's a world record we still hold today. So this was in February 2014 when we finished this journey. I've been back to Antarctica since then. In 2017, I went down and skied solo to the South Pole. So I went on my own this time, but just one way to the pole, and then I flew out from the South Pole. It turns out that there are only 3 of us. I thought it was 2, which I've got 2 fingers up, but it turns out there are 3 people in history that have walked on their own to both the North and South Pole. So it's a small club. I've got 2 slides left. This is one. This is a little feature, the gap between the mountains here. It's a landmark called the Gateway, and it was discovered by Shackleton. And I remember reading about the Gateway in a book when I was, I don't know, 12 or 13 years old. So a lot of people think, like, why would you want to go and do something that's so difficult and so tiring and so dangerous and so exhausting? But to me, there are some really, really special moments. And I remember this day walking up this long snow slope towards the Gateway, thinking, how cool is this? This is like being beamed into the pages of a book that had inspired me since I was a kid. So that is pretty much my story. I was going to finish off by reading you a letter. Now I need to just figure out what's going on with my computer. 2 seconds. Let's move that onto. I've got 2 screens here. Can you still see me okay? Yep.
Sorry, yes.
Cool. So this was a letter, and I just think it's perfect timing for you guys and with what's going on in the world right now. But it was written in 1928, so 92 years ago, by a Norwegian explorer called Fridtjof Nansen, who's a really cool guy. It's worth looking up Nansen, Nansen on Wikipedia. He was an amazing guy and a real hero of mine. But he wrote this 92 years ago to a school in the UK, in the south of England. He said, "You are young, my friends. You have a life ahead of you with all its wonderful possibilities and adventure. I'm sure that someday some of you may become great explorers in one field or other. We are all of us explorers in life, whatever trail we follow. But whether explorer or not, I have one piece of advice to give you. Stick to the work you begin in life till the task is finished and finished well, whatever it may be. Go into it with your whole heart and your whole mind. Do not do things by halves, but carry your task through to the best of your ability, and be not satisfied before you have the feeling that you cannot do it better. It is remarkable how much you learn by doing a thing well. I'm convinced that this is an important secret of real success in life. For we have come here in this world, every one of us, to do our part and to do it well. It is men and women of that kind with the right stuff in them whom the world now needs badly. And you, my young friends, will become some of them. It is a difficult time you are living in, no doubt, and the world does not give you a bright outlook just now, perhaps. But it is an interesting time. Many important things are happening, and it is full of great problems for you to solve. It is you who have to create the future and make the world a better place to live. So I thought he said it better than I could, but I agree with every single one of those words written 92 years ago. So that's my story. Who's got a question?
I have 5 questions for you.
Wow. Okay, go for it.
Somebody else can go first if they want.
One of the questions was, what sort of stuff hurt you when you were going on that big journey? Like, you probably got a fight and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, gosh. I think the hardest things to deal with were the weather. Obviously, it's really cold, really windy, and we had to make sure that we looked after ourselves and looked after each other. We had really good clothing, so we had really warm boots and really warm jackets and clothing and gloves and mittens and masks and things we could wear. But when it was very windy, it was almost like being an astronaut. We couldn't have any skin that was exposed to the cold and the wind, so everything had to be covered up. We had masks and goggles and a hood up, and everything's covered. So then it gets really difficult to do things like putting a tent up in the evening to make your home every night. So the cold was the cold and the wind were the toughest things to deal with, and I think also just the scale of the journey. We were covering this huge distance, and we just got so physically so tired, especially after the weeks and months. We were there for nearly 4 months, so we were hungry and tired, and the scenery didn't change much. So it was physically and mentally really tough. But I think the cold and the winds were the cold and the wind were the things that were hardest to deal with.
Why did you go back to the North Pole alone?
Why did I go back alone? Gosh, good question. I think to me, it seemed like the biggest challenge that I could take on, the most ambitious thing I could do. My first attempt to get to the North Pole was in 2001. So I was 23, which is pretty young to be doing that kind of thing. And I was traveling with one other person, a friend of mine, and I think he was like 41 or 42. So he was much older and much more experienced. And to me, that first trip was so hard that I couldn't imagine doing it on my own. And then I started reading about people that were attempting these things on their own, and it just to me seemed like a really incredible thing to attempt. And in some ways, actually, I mean, I love being around people. I love my friends and my family. So I'm not like a weird loner who sort of wanted to escape society. But it just seemed like the biggest challenge I could do. And actually, when you're on your own, it's quite special in a lot of ways, because you can just live to your own routine. You can get up when you want and stop when you want and go as fast as you want. As soon as there are like two of you or more, as soon as it becomes a team, you have to agree things. You have to say, okay, we're going to wake up at 6 and start walking at 7 and whatever else. So you have a lot of freedom when you're on your own.
Okay.
Did you have another question?
Yeah.
What was your question?
About 15 minutes ago, we watched a video, and it was literally the same thing you were just explaining.
Ah.
We watched your TED Talk, which was great.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
In it, there was like, it said that you at the end you needed a bit of help by a helicopter giving you guys food.
And our question was, how did you mentally overcome the disappointment that you must have felt? Like you said, a year to sort of process.
Yeah. So one thing I was sort of rushing through my story to fit it all in. I didn't want to talk for too long, but yeah, one of the things we had to do, I mentioned we were running low on food after we turned around at the South Pole and we were heading back to the coast, and things got really, really difficult. We had really bad weather. Taka, my teammate, had been ill, and we basically on the way to the pole, we had buried 10 little depots of food, and our plan was to then pick them up on the way back to the coast again. And they were easy to find because we had GPS, so we could mark them with our GPS. And we also put a little flag in the snow. So it was always amazing finding one of these depots and digging up all the food. But we realized that the weather was so bad that we were traveling too slowly. We were going to run out of food before we got to the first depot. So we tried to manage with the food that we had for a while. So we went pretty hungry for about a week, and things got worse and worse and worse. Taka got ill, and I realized I had to make a decision. I had to decide, and the weather was really bad. I thought, well, I was lying in my sleeping bag in the morning thinking, well, we can take a risk and we can get up today and see if we can make it to this depot. But I think it was about 35 or 40 kilometers away, and we weren't really strong enough to cover that in a day. We had less than a day's food left. The weather was getting worse. Taka had been ill, and I thought, okay, I'm in charge here. I've got to make a decision. And the options were, we could either head out into the storm and hope that we were lucky. We could quit. We could call for a rescue. Or I thought maybe we could ask for the plane that would rescue us in an emergency. I wonder if they could bring us some more food. So that's what they did. So they brought us 8 days more food. And at the time, it felt like defeat. It felt like we'd failed. You know, my dream was to do this without having any outside support. And here we were having to ask for help. But actually, looking back now, I'm really proud of that decision. And I think it taught me a lot about how important it is to ask for help sometimes if you're struggling. And it also taught me a bit about, I guess, about like perfectionism. I wanted this to be the perfect expedition, and it was so close to being, you know, to everything being perfect. And here we were having to ask for help. So I think it taught me a lot about aiming for progress, like trying to get better rather than trying to be perfect. Thank you. Who's next?
I'll give you my 6 questions.
6 questions. Whoa, go for it.
What inspired you to become a polar explorer?
Okay, let's do one at a time. Otherwise, I'm going to forget them all. What inspired me? I think it was, as a kid, I loved reading about and hearing about explorers through history, and for some reason, I was really fascinated by Antarctica and the Arctic. I loved reading about Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen and Nansen. So I always loved that stuff when I was a kid. And I grew up in the southwest of the UK. So I was lucky enough to be outdoors a lot in the hills when I was young. I was in the Scouts, loved going camping, loved climbing, loved hiking. So I kind of started dreaming, maybe even when I was a teenager, I started dreaming about doing one expedition. I never thought it would end up being a career. I just thought it would be one expedition, and here I am now, still doing them.
Where are you going next?
Where's next? Well, I can't get anywhere right now. I'm like you. I'm stuck at
Where do you
home.
think you're going to go next?
I'm hoping to go back to Antarctica at the end of this year, so November, December. And my plan is a very
So in the middle of the summer.
In the middle, exactly right. So Antarctica. One of the things I didn't explain in the summer in Antarctica, it is 24-hour daylight, so the sun doesn't set. But in the winter, and we're kind of getting towards, it's like autumn, fall right now in Antarctica. So once it gets into the winter, which is our summer, it's dark.
It's full darkness.
20 total darkness. So you can only go you can only fly in and out when it's light. So I'm hoping to take a team of students. So sadly, a little bit older than you guys, but sort of late teens, early 20s, to do some interesting work down there. So yeah, watch this space. But back to Antarctica.
Did you climb Mount Everest?
No, I did when I was how old was I? 17 or 18. I just left school. I hiked in to Everest Base Camp, so that's as close as I've got. But I've got a few friends that have climbed it. I'm not sure. Part of me would love to do it, but I don't know if you guys saw how busy it got last year. There were hundreds of people queuing, and to me, the great thing about Antarctica is it's this massive wilderness. Tarka and I didn't see anyone for 3.5 months, so that's really special. And I think Everest, I'd find it frustrating if there were loads of people.
What was your longest expedition?
Longest expedition. So that was the one I just told you about. So we called it the Scott expedition after Captain Scott. So it was 108 days and nearly 2,900 kilometers.
Was Penn a peddler or a trader?
Oh, say again, I missed that.
Was Penn a peddler or a trader?
Oh, what do you mean by that? I haven't heard that expression.
I searched up chump on the internet, and those were the two definitions.
Oh. Good question. Pass. I need to think about that.
You know Richard Webber?
I've never met Richard Webber, but we've spoken on email a few times. He's an amazing guy, and he did
my dad
really
he did Arctic Watch.
Exactly. Yeah, and he did an amazing expedition. I think it was maybe in the early 90s. So when I was still at school, he went with a Russian guy called Misha Malakov, just two of them. They went from Canada to the North Pole and then back to Canada again. And no one's ever done that. They're the only people that done that. So yeah, Richard Webber was one of my heroes starting out. He's a cool guy.
Those were all my questions.
Cool, good questions. Thank you. I can see a hand up again.
This is my question, the kid's question. You've had to deal with deep isolation where you couldn't, reach out to people. Well, we're lucky enough to be able to do that. What kind of advice would you give to the kids for isolation? And also, at the end of all this, if you wouldn't mind sharing a link to that letter that you.
Yeah, I will. I'll share that. So I'll email it to the group and. Cool. Yeah. Gosh, what would my advice be? Well, Antarctica, one of the biggest challenges, and this might be the same for you guys all stuck at home right now, was that we were living in this really small space. And once we got into the tent in the evening, we didn't want to get out again until the next day. So actually half our time down there was in a really small space, which was weird because we were in the biggest wilderness on the planet. And yet we were living in this space that it would be illegal to keep prisoners in. So we had to figure out how to get on, and I've done expeditions with bigger teams, 3, 4, 5 people, all sharing a tent. And something that became really important was, and this was, with Tarka and me in Antarctica, was having our own space. So, and for us, there was this imaginary line down the middle of the tent, and one side was mine and one side was his, and we were quite protected. Like the worst thing you could do would be to like put your foot on their sleeping bag, or have some of your gear like spill over onto their side. So having your own space was really important. And we had these sort of pockets on the inside of the tent. When we unpacked all our gear in the evenings, we could sort of arrange our things on our side of the tent. So and we couldn't really escape from each other, but what we could do was just roll over in our sleeping bags, so we were each facing the other way, and it sort of felt like we had a little bit of privacy. So I think having your own space to escape to when you're stuck in isolation is really important. And I think the other thing as well is working out some sort of routine. And for us in Antarctica, our life was very, very simple. It was just walking, and if we weren't walking, we were eating or sleeping. That was about it, really. I mean, we'd update the website, and I'd write my diary, and we'd sometimes have things to fix and repair and glue and sew up in the evenings if our boots had broken or something needed mending. But the routine for us was key. Like, we'd wake up in the morning, the alarm would go off, one of us would start melting snow, we'd make breakfast. We kind of knew exactly what we were going to do each day. And I think that was really important, because if we hadn't agreed that routine, it would have been so tough. This idea of spending nearly 4 months stuck together in this little space we would have gone completely crazy. So I think that routine was important. And then the last thing I'll share is a lesson we learned about sort of what we were thinking about and what we were focusing on. And we were in this environment where so many things were outside our control. And for us, it was the weather and the wind and the visibility and the temperature and all these things. And we realized pretty quickly that if we spent too much time, worrying about things we couldn't change and getting stressed about things we couldn't change, that was a waste of energy. We couldn't do anything about it. So we had to learn to sort of focus on the things that we could change. And for us, that was making sure that we were walking in the right direction. Our navigation was good. We were looking after each other and trying to stay healthy. And I think at the moment, it's so tempting to spend our whole time like looking at the news and looking what's going on and sort of worrying about stuff that we can't really change. So my advice would be to think about who can you help right now? Who else can you reach out to and talk to? Who might be struggling and suffering that might benefit from your time or your conversation on the phone or on a vehicle? So yeah, think about what you can change rather than worrying too much about things you can't change.
So I have a question more for me, at least. Earlier, you were sort of talking about bringing other like younger like kids on your expeditions. Like where would one have to go to sort of like read what's required? Is there anywhere yet?
Oh, good question. Well, I'm about to launch a website probably in the next couple
I think you
weeks.
want to go.
Yeah. So I'll put everything. I'll share a link to it when that's up, and there'll be more on the website. But at the moment, there are a few challenges with Antarctica when it comes to younger people, especially things like insurance and getting permits and things. So I've got a bit of work to do on that front to figure out exactly what's possible. But I'll put it on the website, and I'll make sure I send a link in the next couple of weeks.
All right.
Cool. Any more questions?
If you could share the names of the books that really inspired you as a kid, we would be happy to get them.
Oh wow, yeah. So one of my favorite books it's called The Worst Journey in the World, and I'll email you a link as well to it. But it's by a British guy called Apsley Cherry-Garrard, and he was part of Captain Scott's expedition between 1910.
The worst journey in the world.
The worst journey in the world. And
wow.
Basically, when Captain Scott got to Antarctica, they arrived in the summer because that's when there's no ice, they could sail in. And then they had to build the hut that I showed the photo of. And then they basically spent the winter in the hut when it was dark. And then they had to get up next spring and walk to the pole. But during the winter...
he would have wrote the book.
Exactly. Yeah. So Scott decided to send a small team, 3 people, in the dark to walk down the coast of Ross Island to try and find some penguins, the emperor penguin colony, and try and bring back a penguin egg for scientists to have a look at. And I won't spoil the story, but this is about that. So this isn't about walking to the South Pole. It's about their journey in the Antarctic winter. And it's one of the most amazing books I've ever read. It's quite long, and it's slow to start with because he talks about sailing down to Antarctica, and that takes ages and ages. But it's worth enduring because it's an amazing story. So I'll send a link to that as well.
What inspired you?
I already asked that.
Yeah, what inspired me? So for me, it was kind of reading about explorers and adventurers when I was younger, and I loved. There are a couple of big British explorers from 100 years ago called Scott and Shackleton. So I loved reading about them when I was a kid. And we mentioned actually that there's a Canadian guy called Richard Webber. I read one of his books when I was a teenager, so I blame him a little bit. And it was I think it was reading books when I was a kid. I was fascinated by explorers and by the Arctic and Antarctica. So I'd always dreamt of doing at least one expedition of my own. Cool. Any more questions? No. It must be about lunchtime for you guys.
Yes. Well, we just had lunch. We have a coding class.
Oh wow.
So.
Fantastic. Well, yeah. Interesting. So Taka, my teammate in Antarctica, that's what he does. He's a programmer. So we had in our tent in the evening, we both had a Kindle, so we could read books at night. And I would read novels and travel books and things. And Taka was reading about JavaScript, I think with Java, and learning.
That's what we're using. We're using Java.
Using Java. So yeah, that's what Taka does. He lives in an apartment in Chamonix in the Alps, and he spends half his time skiing and climbing and running and mountain biking, and half his time coding. So I think really, really useful thing to learn. I did a little bit years ago when I first had to make a website for my first expedition in 2001. So I learned to back then that was like HTML and PHP, but it was a really cool thing to learn. So I'm glad you're doing that. I think it's a really, really important skill.
Well, thank you so much for coming to chat with us. This was such a treat.
Real pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Stay safe. Take care, and I'll email you some links and the letter I read.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take care.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Oh my gosh, that was so cool. Oh my goodness.